welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Most often when people discuss government, the discussion concerns the level of taxes imposed on us or the billions and even trillions of dollars that we spend. Regulation, however, is a less visible form of government involvement with our lives and our economy. But government regulations affect virtually every aspect of our economic and daily lives. Regulations often serve important public purposes, but are typically authored by unelected bureaucrats without approval by our elected representatives, and then sometimes issued to advance the self-interest of some parties at the expense of the rest of us. Is there anything that can be done in Alabama to improve the process by which regulations are written and go into effect? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss this issue is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. John Dove. John, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start a little bit talking about regulation generally, because it's sort of like the hidden form of government. We have government laws that get passed, we have government taxes and spending, which generate or get most of the attention. But regulation is also there, and it's really important.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And right, like you said, it really is kind of the hidden aspect where many of us don't necessarily feel the direct costs. Many times it arises through laws that are passed. But really, what it is that a regulation does is to generally constrain some sort of behavior. Sometimes incentivize, but normally constrain some sort of behavior activity, especially economic activity. Business activity is obviously a very big one, where many times you see the purpose behind any sort of regulation is that what you're trying to do is prevent spillovers and costs that arise from business activity from negatively impacting people that aren't necessarily involved in that. Environmental regulation is a very big one that everybody's familiar with, where obviously through economic activity, industrial activity, there are certain pollutants that might be emitted as a result of this activity, and so trying to minimize or prevent those costs that come.
Now, just how important or how large of a scope does regulation have on our lives?
Oh, it's pervasive. It's everywhere. Again, you can think about it as being something like occupational licensing, which requires before you can get a specific job or be admitted to perform a specific job, hours of classroom training, things like that. Healthcare regulation, obviously, that's been a very large one over the past couple of years. Let's see, environmental regulation, as I talked about, anything like that. And again, you have the numbers right here, and this is just federally looking at this. Overall, the actual cost of regulation has been estimated at nearly $2 trillion. That's just compliance costs on an annual basis.
And so the overall impact of regulation would be even sort of beyond that, right?
That's exactly right, because again, this is just looking at federal regulations. Now, if you add on state and local regulations, which I don't know if anybody's actually estimated that, but obviously that's going to be well over $2 trillion at that point.
And when we talk about these costs, these aren't like budgetary costs for the federal government. You couldn't really like look and see on the federal budget when they pass these budget. Well, when they do pass a budget these years. How much you won't see a line item there for like $1.9 trillion, will you?
That's exactly right. This isn't revenue for government. All this is simply a business, you and I, whoever it is, trying to actually comply with a regulation. Because obviously when you regulate something, well, that becomes a cost for a business. Again, if I'm required to reduce the amount of pollution that I emit from my factory, well, maybe the regulation says I need to place scrubbers on my factory. That's obviously a cost. If it's $1 million, well, what we're trying to do here by estimating this is saying, okay, all of those millions of dollars that are required for regulatory compliance, factories, airlines have many. What does that actually amount to?
And is it really true that you're up in the thousands of regulations that are put out every year?
That's exactly right. Yeah, at this point, so as you see here, new regulations, what is it, just this year's almost 3,700 new regulations. Since 1993, 87,000 regulations. Again, this all goes into the Federal Register, which now at this point, largely as a result of these regulations, is pushing 80,000 pages at this point, which is, I'd like to know how high that actually would be if you stacked it up. I have to imagine it's several feet tall.
And this is just regulation at the federal, these are just federal regulations here. So you have state and local regulations on top of this.
That's exactly right. Again, states are just as active when it comes to regulating economic activity as the federal government is. So are local governments as well. Again, one of the biggest ones that we see at the local level are things like zoning laws. What is it that I can and can't use my property for, or what sort of things do I have to have included on my property before I can use it for whatever purpose it is, whether it be a business or even my own home. Again, those are regulations that, by requiring certain things, by requiring me to do certain things, impose a definite cost on me, and one that I have to account for.
Now, where do these regulations come from? Because they don't, Congress passes certain laws that allow regulations. These are not laws that are being enacted by Congress all the time, and they're not always executive orders coming from the president or governor. Where do these regulations come from?
Right, that's a great question. Most of this comes from administrative bodies that have been set up through laws or anything like that. Because again, when it comes to the passage of a law, well, you have to interpret a law. Many times you do have to actually figure out, okay, what is it that we're actually trying to regulate here? Again, great examples. You can think of the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Aviation Administration. These are all administrative bodies that are required with regulating those industries. Food and Drug Administration is charged with overseeing food safety and food quality, along with pharmaceuticals, ensuring pharmaceutical quality, so that you and I don't get sick from taking a bad medicine or anything like that. And
so these issues get proposed and announced by a agency, and then they become law, or they go into effect? Yeah,
that's exactly right. They go into effect, and at that point, individuals and businesses, whoever it might be, are required to adhere to those rules.
So what is the sort of underlying rationale for regulations? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but do any of these regulations actually perform any valuable services for our economy?
Sure, again, and as I said before, we're really, anytime that you see any sort of economic activity, obviously we're pursuing economic activity because it leads to lots of benefits across many individuals. But at the same time, there are byproducts associated with economic activity. Again, the easiest example is to think about pollution that gets emitted in the process of making some sort of product. Well, the issue with that is, as a result of that pollution, there are obviously third-party individuals that are adversely affected by that. And most importantly, many times, those are individuals that weren't even involved in the production or the transaction that occurred as a result of that production. So really what it is that regulations try to do is account for those costs that get created and force the individuals or businesses that created those costs to fully account and pay for those, and in so doing reduce the actual negative consequences that come from that.
So there are some valuable ends or public policy goals that regulations can advance, but sometimes regulations don't always advance these public policy goals. Sometimes they end up being implemented for other purposes, right?
Sure, that's exactly right. And again, the purpose of regulation and what we hope to see is that the regulations that are passed, at least from an economic standpoint, would be regulations that pass, cost-benefit analysis. If the benefit associated with a regulation is greater than the cost that they impose, well, in general, it's probably a relatively efficient regulation. Unfortunately, as you point out, that many times what we see emerge through the regulatory process is that specific individuals, specific special interests become very involved in the process. Obviously, if I'm in the airline industry, a member of that industry, and I know that the Federal Aviation Administration is charged with regulating that industry, well, I have a real incentive to sit there and try to work directly with the FAA in order to get regulations that are less onerous on me and many times might actually benefit my own interests, but then at the expense of everybody else.
And so one of the ways regulators could do this, regulations can accomplish this, is by putting costs onto your on other businesses in the industry, right?
That's exactly right, and that's something that we see all the time across industries. A great example of this is when you look at the toy manufacturer Mattel. After the Chinese toy scare, where several children across the country had eaten lead paint that had been painted onto toys manufactured in China, well, there's a real push in Congress to enact legislation to prevent that from happening in the future. Again, it's well intended. We want to protect children. Unfortunately, what we actually saw emerge was that the safety standards that Congress effectively ended up passing were the ones that Mattel was already using. And it was because Mattel had actually lobbied directly saying, just use these standards. Well, the problem there is that's not imposing any sort of cost on Mattel. They're already doing it. What it did was to actually raise the costs on all of their competitors. And as a result of that, we actually see a reduction in competition, which is the exact opposite intent of what it is that we want to see regulations do.
And because a lot of these regulations are addressing important, complicated issues, it can be very difficult to know exactly when a regulation could be advancing a private interest as opposed to public interest, right?
That's exactly right. And even the most well-intended policies, this is something that you and I probably teach our students on a regular basis, that good intentions don't necessarily lead to good outcomes. And even the most well-intended policy, one that truly is meant to protect children from eating lead paint on toys, many times has unintended consequences that actually just benefit a very concentrated or small interest at the expense of everybody else.
So another potential problem then with the regulations would be whether they actually accomplish or advance their public policy purpose, right? An economy is a complicated system, and it's not easy to design a regulation that's going to have our intended effects and not have these side effects. So that's an important part of the question too, right?
That's exactly right. We call that regulatory capture. Economists call that regulatory capture, where you have a situation where the regulators that are actually intended to prevent all of these negative spillovers being imposed on you and I actually become captured by the very industries that they're trying to regulate and actually end up over time passing regulations that are to the benefit of that industry or specific groups within that industry at the expense of everybody else. And that's a huge problem.
So these are some of both the goals of the regulatory process and then also some of the potential drawbacks or some of the ways in which we could end up with regulations that may be too costly or not advancing their purposes. So how might we go about trying to improve this regulatory process?
Yeah, and that's another great question, and it's something that a lot of people have tried to address. I've tried to address some of this with a co-author of mine, really looking at, again, those situations where even if you have a well-intended policy or a well-intended regulation, well, what happens if over time that regulation becomes too burdensome or too costly? Or if you have a regulation where simply as a result of the fact that, again, we don't know the future and circumstances change, well, it becomes too costly in the future. What can you actually do in order to address those regulations, to evaluate those regulations and see whether they should remain on the books, or try to figure out, are there actually better or more appropriate ways that we could try to regulate the behavior that we're attempting to look at?
Now, fortunately, economists and other people in the public policy arena have tried to think of a bunch of different ways we could improve the regulatory process, and some of these improvements have been imposed both at the federal level and the state level. So what are some of the ideas, some of the great ideas we have as economists and other public policy scholars about improving the regulatory process?
Right, so some things that I tried to look at was, okay, so what actually exists right now as far as how it is that regulations are evaluated, whether they be on an annual basis or just a frequent basis. I specifically looked at the state level, trying to see what impact that might have. Some of the bigger ideas that have come up are things like sunset provisions, which what a sunset provision does is actually require periodically either Congress or a state legislature or even some sort of regulatory administrative body to reevaluate the regulations that they passed previously. Again, the intent being and the purpose being that moving forward, it's quite possible that a certain regulation today, which actually does provide many more benefits than they cost, well, in the future, that might flip, and now it's just pure cost or extremely costly to keep imposing that regulation. So a sunset provision requires those agencies to review the regulations periodically to see are they still meeting their intended goals. I think that's been a really big one that we tried to look at.
And that would actually be pretty well designed to address a problem in politics, and the fact that, like, once a regulation gets initially passed, if there's no action required for it to stay on the books, it is likely to, through inertia, just stay there, and without any kind of affirmative response to come through a second time and say, yes, this is really providing benefits, right?
That's exactly right, and we see that all the time where, again, the way the political process works, it's like you say, it's really quite easy for something to end up on the books, and then there's no incentive at that point to ever readdress it or reapproach it, so it just sits there. And as you showed earlier, that's how you end up with over 80,000 pages in the Federal Register, is many times because you have what are effectively, a lot of times, dormant regulations or dormant laws that are just there. Unfortunately, some of the problems with that is, well, one, you still have to remain in compliance with them, and many times those become extremely costly, or a lot of times you set up a situation where now you can just arbitrarily enforce regulations, where maybe a regulation is completely dormant on the books, nobody really remembers or knows it, but then all of a sudden some crafty regulator finds it and starts applying it.
Right. And another thing is, one of the factors we have here is on this list is an economic cost benefit review, which,
right,
as an economist, we're particularly fond of because it relates to what exactly here?
Yeah, again, just exactly what I'm trying to talk about, where if we are going to impose regulations, what we want to see are regulations that create economic benefits, or just benefits period, that exceed the costs associated with the regulation and in complying with that regulation. And so that's really what it is that economic cost benefit analysis requires, is that regulators or administrative bodies, before they actually impose a regulation, they're tasked with actually sitting down and trying to determine, well, what are going to be the actual economic cost benefits associated with this, right? Because obviously, without any thought of that, it's quite possible that you have a regulation that provides $3,000 in benefit, but then also is so onerous that it ends up costing whoever's being regulated $1 million. Well, at that point, it's almost pointless to have such a regulation. But without actually trying to sit down and address that question, what are the actual economic costs and benefits, it's hard to determine or decide any of that.
And in some of these reviews that are in place across different states, they would be a good way to address the issue of if a specific agency is being captured by regulated interests. If then, like say the Attorney General or the state legislature also has to review the regulations that are coming out of an agency. It's a good way to address the capture problem, right?
That's exactly right. Because again, a lot of times what we see, these administrative agencies, they aren't elected bodies. They're appointed by an executive, sometimes legislative branch, or sometimes some other group. But what you really want to see is to create those checks and balances, which we care about so much. Again, we see it at every level of government. And so what this can do is, by requiring additional individuals or additional bodies, again, whether it be the state legislature, the state attorney general, or some other office in state government, to also periodically review these regulations or to review them before they are actually implemented. Again, it provides sort of those checks and balances against the potential and the opportunity for industries and special interest groups to actually capture those regulatory agencies.
And you did a study recently, which has been published or been accepted for publications. Yes. In the publication process, looking at this at the state level, and why is it that the state level provides a good way for us to be able to sort of test all of these different bright ideas that economists have about improving the regulatory process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it goes back to the idea that states are kind of that laboratory of policy experimentation. And so what we see is that all states have different ways of approaching how they review or how they implement regulations. And so what my co-author and I tried to do was look at, well, okay, what then are the actual regulatory review processes that are in place, and which ones actually have some sort of direct impact on the levels of regulation that we see within a state, just to try to tease out and understand, well, are some of these review processes more effective than others at actually impacting regulations within a state overall?
And these are some of the ways you tried to measure the amount of regulation at the state level. It's a problem because although people have measured the regulation at the federal level, you're measuring state level regulations is a lot of hard work, and that's not always an easy thing to do, right?
That's exactly right. Again, 50 different states, lots of different regulations, lots of states that aren't necessarily the most transparent as far as the regulations that they do pass or are trying to pass. But so what we did do was try to take a number of potential measures that might at least proxy for the amount of regulation that exists in the state. So we have, again, here that you show is the Forbes regulatory ranking, which is basically the cost of doing business in a state, looking specifically at the state regulatory environment, regulatory enforcement expenditures. We kind of thought that using that as a measure of regulation was good, simply because obviously if you're a state with more regulation on the books, then it's quite possible that in order to enforce those regulations, well, it's going to cost more money for you as a state. Looking at those regulations challenged in court, state court, and then overturned by state supreme courts, trying to get at this idea of, well, maybe that kind of helps us understand those regulations that might meet or may not meet cost-benefit analysis in some way. And then actually looking at the number of regulatory rules, and especially those that have an economic impact. Unfortunately, those latter two, there are only 28 states where that information is available.
And how does Alabama stand on these measures, both of overall level of regulation and some of our review procedures?
Right, yeah, so Alabama overall is probably middle of the pack. The Forbes rank I have here is actually a little bit old now. I looked at it just before coming in, and Alabama has actually fallen to about 20th overall now. So definitely put them around in middle of the pack as far as the overall regulatory environment goes. If you look at the actual legislative review in the state, there are a number of processes that are in place. There are sunset provisions required for regulations. You do have to look at what impact is this actually going to have on a state's budget. Some cost-benefit analysis. Most of this put through this Joint Committee on Administrative Regulation review.
So when you did your study and looked across the states, what came out as possibly of all these bright ideas economists and others have come up with to regulate the regulatory process? What seems to have an effect?
The largest effect that we found was sunset provisions, which we talked about. That seemed to most consistently have a positive impact on overall regulations. We also found that, interestingly, government cost-benefit analysis had an impact, which government cost-benefit analysis actually requires before a regulation is going to be placed, is going to be put in place. What effect is this actually going to have on the state government's budget? Which obviously, if I'm a state government or in state government, I don't necessarily want to see my budget shrink. If we're passing a regulation that's going to lead to things like lower tax revenue and overall budget in general, may not want to pass that regulation. Alternative approaches to affecting the same outcome. In other words, looking at, are there lower cost ways that we can go about implementing effectively the same regulation or the same desired goal? That also seems to have an impact, and that's a very important one too. Just at least trying to look at, do we have alternative options available to us that could be lower cost in the long run?
Looking at what's the variations across states provides a really good way to analyze some of the things that have been tried to date, but people have some ideas about things that could possibly be done to alter the regulatory process that aren't being used by any states right now. So what are some ideas that, sort of are in the pipeline or just at the proposal stage now?
Right. I think one of the bigger ones that we've seen just in the recent past is actually federal, which is the RAINS Act. And this is actually a proposed piece of legislation which would require the federal government, anytime that there was a regulation that was going to expected to have a cost of $100 million or more on the economy, it would actually require congressional approval before it could be implemented. So again, it just goes back to really creating those checks and balances and trying to ensure that we minimize that regulatory capture. That's one of the larger ones that I think we've seen.
And at least on the surface, that would seem the RAINS Act would seem to have an effect on any regulatory agency that's out of control. And a lot of people in Congress are claiming like the Environmental Protection Agency is out of control. But are these agencies always as out of control as Congress sometimes wants to make it sound like they are? Or?
Well, that's also part of the issue too, because obviously it's all a political process. Everybody responds to the incentives and constraints that they face. They respond to voter preferences and also special interests that try to influence them. So is it necessarily the case that this is going to lead to some sort of perfect outcome where now we've created an environment where we're only passing those regulations that meet some sort of cost-benefit test? No, absolutely not. But what it does really is just create that environment of checks and balances, increasing the checks and balances that exist, and hopefully might have some sort of positive outcome in the long run.
One last thing to touch on, because didn't come out as very effective in your review at the state level, is the cost-benefit analysis. And so what is sort of like the problem or weakness with cost-benefit analysis as it's practiced by governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as economists, like you said, we care about cost-benefit analysis. That's how we try to, evaluate policies and policy proposals. Unfortunately, at the government level, again, you have a situation where, well, what really is a cost? What really is a benefit? Mm-hmm. How do we go about addressing this? If you look at administrative agencies, many times, they'll have their own estimates. Then obviously you'll have industry that has its own estimates. They both have their own interests that they're trying to placate to. And many times you see administrative agencies that are actually looking at the costs and benefits that industry might be passing itself. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the actual costs and benefits. Those are definitely the ones that will impact them, but may not be looking at, well, what's going to be the actual overall impact on the state or the national economy.
So cost-benefit analysis isn't always done up to the standards that we as economists would like to see it done to.
That's exactly right. And even if it could be done up to a standard that we would like to see, it's still very difficult. I mean, and really, at the end of the day, how do you actually measure what is an actual cost and what is an actual benefit? We try to estimate that, think in terms of dollar amounts, try to estimate that effect. But again, thinking about things like value and what that is, well, value is completely subjective. I could be just infinitely made worse off as a result of some sort of activity. How do we account for something like that? Do we account for something like that? So again, we want to see how do we do this, but it's very difficult.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.